Hi everyone. Destiny 2's 22nd season, Season of the Witch, has graced us warlocks with some new exotic gauntlets, the BRIAR Binds. What follows will be a high-level overview of the gauntlets from the perspective of a long-time warlock main. Spoiler alert, I think these gauntlets are so essential and inspire a playstyle so obvious and tantalizing that I do not think that I will ever unequip them when I am playing Voidwalker. And I also got such a good roll on them on the first day of the season. So, what exactly do these gauntlets do? Well, their exotic perk is as follows. Your Void Souls have a longer duration. They also gain escalating damage and durability as they defeat targets. You can retrieve your Void Souls by interacting with them, allowing them to be redeployed. This is an interesting exotic because it entices the player into a much more active playstyle than the Child of the Old Gods aspect typically engenders. This is because the player may chain their Void Soul essentially forever by continuously deploying it, gathering it, and redeploying it. To display this new style of gameplay that the BRIAR Binds foster, I ran a Law Sector twice. Yeah, I know, twice. Once with the exotic and once without, and I paid close attention to how I chose to use the Void Soul each time. Without the exotic, I found myself being quite careful with where I sent my Void Soul. I wanted to maximize its use, so I elected only to send it at large groups of rank and file enemies or beefier targets to debuff them. There were times when I felt that I had chosen my Void Soul's position incorrectly, but my lack of exotic offered no recourse. As such, I began playing around my Rift cooldown way more so that I could summon a new Void Soul. Had I put more consideration into my build, I probably would have specced more into recovery to maximize Rift and thus Void Soul uptime. With the exotic equipped, however, these concerns were immediately alleviated. Because the exotic not only allows but heavily incentivizes summoning and maintaining one continuously strengthening Void Soul, my gameplay became much more dynamic and interesting. With the thought that I could simply reposition a poorly placed Void Soul in mind, I would basically ping-pong between groups of enemies, deploying my Void Soul on the approach and gathering it upon my exit. During this process, my Void Soul would get kills, which would increase its durability and damage on top of the Void Verb weaken that it would already be applying. Now that I had seen just how dynamic Voidwalker Warlock could become with these gauntlets, I began to consider different builds one could use to maximize this massive Void Soul uptime. Lately I've been trying to use some weapon types that I have historically underused, so I started to consider some of my oft-forgotten options. I eventually realized that glaives would complement these gauntlets very well. That glaives are most powerful at close range means that I could easily collect and redeploy a Void Soul in the middle of a group of enemies, which would maintain the tempo that these gloves inspire. Vexcalibur, the exotic glaive from Season 20, seemed to be the most obvious choice for which glaive to use. This exotic makes getting Void Overshields extremely simple. Once the player gets even the slightest amount of overshield rolling from a glaive block, each glaive melee kill will grant them a full Void Overshield. This, along with the fragments I chose to run, means that your close-range ping-pongy playstyle can be maintained for maximum Void Soul uptime. So, my build was as follows. My aspects were Child of the Old Gods, duh, and Feed the Void, which I chose because Devour is literally in the game, and I was not focusing on grenades that much to warrant Chaos Accelerant. For fragments, I chose Echo of Expulsion for fun Void explosions, and that juicy and totally worth it plus 10 intellect. Echo of Leeching, mainly for plus 10 resilience, but also specifically for this build because glaive melee final blows also proc this fragment. Echo of Exchange, because glaive melee kills also proc it, and finally Echo of Persistence to extend the uptime of Devour and the Void Overshields from Vexcalibur. Frankly, I gave little thought to my armor mods and just ran basic orb generating mods and surges. Here's the setup if you'd like to see it, I guess. In terms of stats, my armor is best optimized for resilience and discipline. Can you tell that the last time I actually grinded out armor in this godforsaken video game was in summer 2022 during Season of the Haunted. But if I were to redo my stats, I would spec more into recovery to keep rifts coming just in case something horrible happens and our Void Soul expires. Oh, and not that it's that important, but I'm running Vortex Nade because, well, don't the Vortex Nade and Void Soul seem like they belong together? So after I made the build, I put it to the mildest test known to humankind, the Savathûn Spire seasonal activity. And, well, it actually did pretty well. The main gameplay loop is as follows. Shoot something with Excalibur to charge its block, place a rift to summon a Void Soul, shoot a good target to deploy the Void Soul, block any incoming attack you can while approaching the Void Soul to gain a Void Overshield. Then use the glaive melee to maintain the Void Overshield and finish off the enemies weakened by the Void Soul. Then grab the Void Soul and redeploy it into a new group of enemies and try to maintain the single ever strengthening Void Soul and your Void Overshield for as long as possible. This ends up working quite well. I found that enemies easily fell and I was able to maintain my life, and also that this setup was very, very good at maintaining the weaken debuff on a boss. However, there are certainly a few caveats. First, the Void Soul can only be deployed by a glaive shot, not its melee hit, and the glaive shot typically one-shots red bar enemies. So it's actually best to have something like a primary weapon or a heavy machine gun equipped in order to tag an enemy to deploy the soul. Honestly, this caveat actually just makes the playstyle more interesting to me. It made me think more about the role of my machine gun, in particular, in my kit, and it made swapping weapons on the fly a necessity. Second, you'll often find yourself deploying the Void Soul just to refresh its cooldown, which is not a huge deal, but it's still something to consider. Also, this setup lacks in range greatly, so make sure you have some backup options should you need damage at greater range. Overall, this particular setup with a glaive may not be the most viable for something like endgame activities, probably because glaives really aren't viable in situations like that anyway. But it definitely worked a different part of my Destiny playing brain. My Voidwalker gameplay became so active and so consistently engaging that, as I explained above, I see these gauntlets as being essential to my Voidwalker experience going forward. Even without a CQC monster like a glaive or a sword, the Briar Binds change the way that this subclass is played, as my earlier Lost Sector gameplay showed. I believe that the Briar Binds, in their fundamental shakeup of the Voidwalker subclass, do what all good exotics should do. Provide a genuinely unique gameplay experience that can be built into in myriad ways. I mean, I didn't even touch on the potential of Empowering Rift with these gauntlets, seeing as your Void Soul while on Empowering Rift heals you. In conclusion, these gauntlets are an amazing addition to any Warlock's arsenal, and you should totally get them now.